Florida sold you a lie before you were even born. Pull up a map of the state's interior, the flat green stretch of land immediately south of Lake Okeechobee. And in the early 1900s, the government told buyers that exact stretch was rich, drainable farmland, guaranteed to grow, guaranteed to make you money. It wasn't. Zoom into the actual land records from that era, and you'll find plots sold to buyers who never once set foot on them, sight unseen. Some of it still sitting under several feet of swamp water on the exact day the deed changed hands. That fraud helped destroy the largest subtropical wetland in North America, and taxpayers are still paying to undo it today, more than $23 billion and counting, on a stretch of the map that still isn't finished being repaired. But trace the rest of this state's outline, and that isn't even the strangest thing sitting inside it. Push the camera down to the very southern tip of the peninsula, and you'll find land that isn't technically part of North America at all. Climatically, biologically, geologically, a fragment of the Caribbean welded onto the bottom of Georgia by an accident of melting ice. Slide up to the panhandle, and you're looking at a border drawn almost entirely over an argument about a shipping port. And buried inside the same map is a war the United States government fought 3 separate times, lost the will to finish, and never officially ended. Florida isn't the punchline everyone treats it as. Trace the actual lines on this map and it might be the single strangest state in the entire country. Here's the proof. Start where the peninsula ends and the Keys begin, because this is the clearest place to actually see the seam between two different landmasses. 20,000 years ago, during the peak of the last ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked up in glaciers that global sea levels sat more than 400 feet lower than they do today. Picture the coastline pulling back, retreating for miles in every direction, exposing a much wider shelf of land than exists on any current map, a shelf geologists called the Florida Platform. As the ice melted and the water crept back in, it drowned most of that exposed shelf, carving the coastline down to the narrow peninsula you'd recognize today, and leaving behind a curving trail of high points just barely above the rising water, a string of fossilized coral reef remnants stretching southwest into the Gulf. Follow that trail on the map and you're tracing the exact shape of the Florida Keys. Islands that aren't built from ordinary continental rock at all, but from compacted coral skeleton and marine sediment, the same building material you'd find under Caribbean islands hundreds of miles to the south. Zoom in on the biology and the pattern holds. Trace a line from the southern tip of the Keys down across open water, and the nearest genetic relatives of many native plants and animals down there aren't found anywhere else in the continental United States. They're on the other end of that line, in Cuba, less than 100 miles away, and scattered throughout the islands of the West Indies. Overlay a climate map on top of all this, and the boundary becomes even sharper. Everywhere else in the lower 48, no matter how brutal the summer heat gets, the climate classification reads subtropical or temperate. Only the very bottom sliver of the state, the Keys and the tip of the peninsula, crosses into a true tropical classification. The same band on the map used for Cuba, Central America, and the Amazon. Push the camera down into the water itself and the biology gets stranger. Somewhere in the tangle of freshwater marsh and brackish coastline at the southern edge of the Everglades, two ranges overlap that meet nowhere else on the planet: the American alligator's southernmost reach and the American crocodile's northernmost reach, crossing in the exact same stretch of water, which makes this the only place on Earth where the two species share the same habitat side by side. Follow the coastline further southwest, and the land itself starts to dissolve into water, breaking apart into what mapmakers call the 10,000 Islands, a maze of mangrove islets so dense and repetitive that early surveyors gave up trying to count them individually and just settled on a number that basically meant too many to map. Mangroves are a tropical tree family, salt-tolerant, propped up on stilted roots, structurally identical to the mangrove coastlines of the Bahamas or the Yucatan, and they simply cannot grow along the temperate coastline a few hundred miles north in Georgia or the Carolinas, because a single hard freeze kills them outright. And because the climate down here genuinely behaves like the tropics rather than merely resembling them, South Florida has become one of the easiest landing spots in the entire country for tropical species that escape captivity to establish permanent breeding populations, something that can't happen almost anywhere else in the lower 48. Burmese pythons, native to the jungles of Southeast Asia, now number in the tens of thousands across the Everglades. Green iguanas from Central America bask on seawalls throughout Miami-Dade County in numbers large enough that during rare cold snaps, wildlife officials issue public warnings about frozen, stunned iguanas literally dropping out of trees onto sidewalks. None of that happens in Alabama. It happens here because this stretch of coastline was never really the same climate zone as the rest of the country to begin with. Now pull all the way back out, past the peninsula, past the panhandle, and let the frame widen until the whole Gulf Coast is visible, because the second crack in the map is man-made, and you can trace its cause with a single line on a border chart. Follow Florida's northern edge west from the peninsula and watch it stretch on and on along the top of Alabama, reaching almost all the way to Mississippi. A shape that looks less like a natural coastline and more like someone drawing as far west as they could physically get away with. Compare it to the tidy, ruler-straight state lines running through the middle of the country, drawn decades later along latitude and longitude with almost no controversy attached. And the panhandle looks like exactly what it is, a leftover boundary from an era when borders in this part of the continent were still being fought over one port at a time. That's essentially exactly what happened. Spain held Florida for centuries, but by the early 1800s, its grip had become almost impossible to defend, with unauthorized American settlers pushing across the border and escaped slaves and Seminole raiders using Spanish territory as a base the United States treated as a constant security threat. In 1818, General Andrew Jackson marched an American army straight into Spanish Florida without authorization from Congress and seized the Spanish forts at Pensacola and St. Mark's, an invasion aggressive enough to nearly trigger a crisis with two foreign powers at once. While occupying St. Mark's, Jackson captured two British subjects, a Scottish trader named Alexander Arbuthnot and a former Royal Marine officer named Robert Ambrister, both accused of supplying the Seminoles. Jackson convened his own military tribunal, had both men convicted within days, and personally overruled the court's lighter sentence for Ambrister, ordering him executed by firing squad alongside Arbuthnot, who was hanged from the yardarm of his own captured ship. Picture the reaction rippling outward on a map of the Atlantic. British protests crossing the ocean from London, Spanish protests crossing from Madrid, and a formal congressional investigation opening back in Washington into whether an American general had just committed an act of international lawlessness on foreign soil. Congress ultimately let it go, and the incident helped convince Spain it no longer had any realistic way to hold the territory at all. Zoom into Pensacola specifically, and you can see exactly why the fight mattered as much as it did. It controlled one of the best deep-water ports on the entire Gulf Coast, a prize Spain desperately wanted to keep, and the United States desperately wanted to take. When American Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and Spanish Minister Luis de Onás finally sat down to draw a permanent line across the map, that border wasn't shaped by any river, ridge, or natural feature at all. It was shaped by who got to control the ports and the buffer zone along the Gulf. The Adams-Onás Treaty was signed in February of 1819, and the Panhandle's unnatural westward reach across the top of two other states exists today because of exactly that negotiation, a border drawn over shipping lanes, not geography. And here's the twist worth putting directly next to the earlier Caribbean claim, because it flips the whole biology story on its head. While the tip of the peninsula spent the last ice age submerged and disconnected, cut off from the mainland as an isolated fragment that would only reattach once the water dropped, the Panhandle did the exact opposite. It stayed anchored to the North American continent through every rise and fall of sea level during the entire Pleistocene epoch, acting as a permanent mainland refuge for species that had nowhere else to retreat to whenever water levels climbed. Trace the Apalachicola River on a map, running more than 100 miles down through the Panhandle before spreading into Apalachicola Bay, and you're tracing what ecologists now rank among the handful of true biodiversity hotspots in the entire United States, a single river system supporting more than 90 species of fish and 30 species of freshwater mussels, more than any other river in the state, feeding a bay that alone produces over 90% of Florida's oysters. So the same state contains two opposite biological extremes, depending entirely on which end of the map you're looking at: a southern tip that's essentially transplanted Caribbean island, and a northern panhandle that's one of the most stable, continuously inhabited mainland ecosystems in the entire eastern United States. Same state outline, two completely different biological histories stitched together at the seams. That same 1819 treaty is also where the deepest, strangest thread running through this entire map actually begins, because the border didn't just transfer land, it transferred an unfinished war. Follow the settlement pattern across Florida through the 1700s, and you'll see the Seminole people forming gradually, not as a single ancient nation confined to one spot on the map, but as Creek communities from Georgia and Alabama migrated south into Spanish territory, merging over time with older indigenous groups already scattered across the peninsula, and with enslaved people who'd escaped beyond the reach of American slaveholders. That merger created something the United States found deeply threatening, sitting right on its new southern border: a mixed, self-governing, armed community of free Black and indigenous people living entirely outside American control. Jackson's 1818 invasion, the same one that forced Spain's hand, is now formally remembered as the First Seminole War. Once Florida became American territory in 1821, federal policy swung hard toward removal. In 1823, Seminole leaders signed the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, agreeing to confine themselves to a 4 million-acre reservation stamped onto the map of Central Florida in exchange for government payments. It didn't hold. Within less than a decade, policy shifted again, this time toward pushing the Seminoles entirely off the peninsula and out to Indian Territory in what's now Oklahoma. A small number of leaders were pressured into signing the Treaty of Payne's Landing in 1832, agreeing to relocation, but most Seminoles refused to recognize it as legitimate. When the Army arrived in 1835 to enforce it anyway, the Seminoles were ready and dragged American forces into terrain no conventional map could help them navigate: dense hammocks, sawgrass prairie, and swamp that swallowed roads and canceled out the Army's usual advantages entirely. The Second Seminole War that followed became the longest, costliest, and deadliest conflict the United States ever fought against any native nation. 7 years of fighting across a landscape fewer than 2,000 Seminole warriors knew intimately, and an American force that eventually swelled past 30,000 barely understood it all. A 15-to-1 imbalance in raw numbers that still wasn't enough to secure a decisive American victory anywhere on the map. Osceola, one of the most legendary of the Seminole leaders, was captured under a white flag of truce in 1837, an act widely condemned even at the time as a betrayal of basic military honor, and the war ground on for 5 more years under other leaders, including a respected medicine man and war leader named Abiaka, directing resistance from deep inside terrain the Army still couldn't chart. By 1842, the United States had spent more than $20 million, close to 10% of the entire federal budget at the time, and lost more than 1,500 soldiers, most to tropical disease rather than combat. And there was still no peace treaty. Trace the original Moultrie Creek reservation boundary on an old territorial map, and you can see exactly where the whole plan fell apart from the start. A 4 million-acre box drawn across the interior with almost no coastline access at all. Land the Seminoles themselves had warned negotiators was too poor to farm, a promise on paper that never matched the ground it was supposedly describing. A third Seminole War broke out in 1855, sparked in part when government survey crews cut directly through the property of a Seminole leader named Billy Bowlegs, an act of deliberate provocation on a map that was never truly settled to begin with. This war ended differently than the first two. There was no dramatic victory, no capture of a legendary leader, no treaty signing. Facing a Seminole population that had dwindled to a few hundred people, scattered and nearly impossible to locate deep in the Everglades, American forces eventually gave up on military solutions and simply started paying people to leave, offering as much as $500 a warrior to relocate west voluntarily. Billy Bowlegs accepted and departed with part of his remaining band in 1858. But even that didn't close the story. Exhausted and unable to make real progress against a population that knew this landscape infinitely better than any American map ever could, the Army simply stopped fighting in 1858 and walked away, leaving the rest behind, scattered across a stretch of Everglades and big cypress swamps so remote that no accurate American map of the interior would exist for decades afterward. To this day, the Seminole tribe of Florida is widely recognized, including by the tribe itself, as the only Native American nation in the United States that never signed a formal peace treaty ending its war with the federal government. The fighting stopped because the United States walked off the map, not because the Seminoles were defeated. And the story didn't end there either. In 1957, more than a century after the fighting stopped, the Seminole tribe of Florida formally organized under federal law, establishing a tribal government recognized by the same country that had once spent $20 million trying to force their ancestors off this exact stretch of land. In 1979, the tribe opened a high-stakes bingo hall on their Hollywood reservation, a single dot on the map just north of Miami, deliberately testing the argument that, as a sovereign nation, they weren't bound by Florida's gambling laws. A fight they won in federal court, and one that helped establish the legal foundation for tribal gaming nationwide. That single dot on the map eventually grew into a global empire. In 2007, the Seminole tribe purchased Hard Rock International outright for nearly $1 billion, the first Native American tribe in history to own a major global hospitality brand. And if you tried to plot every property in that portfolio today, you'd need a world map, not a state map. Casinos and hotels scattered from Las Vegas to Europe to Asia, all traced back to a reservation boundary that used to represent nothing but the last patch of land the United States couldn't take. Today, the tribe's holdings are estimated at somewhere around $12 billion, built by the direct descendants of the roughly 200 people who refused to leave the Everglades in 1858. Now bring the camera back down into the middle of the state, into the flat green heart of the peninsula, because this is where Florida's biggest lie was actually built, on a stretch of land that used to look nothing like what's on the map today. Before drainage, this was a slow-moving sheet of fresh water roughly 60 miles wide and 100 miles long, stretching from Lake Okeechobee south toward Florida Bay. So vast and so gradual in its movement that people eventually just started calling it the River of Grass. By the late 1800s, state officials and land speculators looked at that same stretch of water and saw nothing but wasted potential. Florida's governor, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, ran for office in 1904 on an explicit promise to drain it, publicly calling it an abominable, pestilence-ridden swamp. Once elected, he hired a government scientist named James Wright to survey the region, and Wright's report concluded that just 8 canals, drawn like straight incisions across the map, could drain nearly 2 million acres into farmable soil. That single wildly optimistic report ignited a land rush. Developers started selling plots of this not yet drained swamp to buyers who'd never once stood on the property, some of it still sitting under several feet of water at the exact moment the deed changed hands. In a practice so notorious it earned the nickname selling land by the gallon. Dredging began in 1906. Canals were cut across the map exactly as Wright had promised, and thousands of acres genuinely started to dry out, fueling even more confident engineering reports and even more aggressive sales. Then, reality caught up. Wright's survey had dramatically underestimated the region's rainfall and soil composition, and by 1914 he'd been publicly branded a fraud, taking Florida's swampland real estate market down with him. That collapse turned out to be a preview of something much bigger unfolding across the entire state map. The same speculative energy that drove the Everglades land rush exploded statewide through the mid-1920s in what's remembered today as the Florida land boom, a genuine mania in which undeveloped lots, some of them still underwater, changed hands so rapidly that certain Miami properties were reportedly bought and resold at auction up to 10 times in a single day, each sale higher than the last. Almost nobody involved ever actually laying eyes on the plot they were buying, let alone checking where it actually sat on a map. The con man, Charles Ponzi, freshly out of prison for the pyramid scheme that still bears his name, even got in on it, marketing swampy, worthless Florida acreage sight unseen to buyers up north through glossy brochures that bore only a loose relationship to the actual plots being sold. The bubble popped even faster than it inflated. A railroad embargo choked off building supplies in 1925. A sunken ship blocked the Miami harbor for weeks. And in September of 1926, a massive hurricane tore directly through the city, killing roughly 400 people and flattening entire unfinished developments overnight. Florida's economy collapsed years before the rest of the country, sliding into its own private depression a full 3 years before Wall Street crashed in 1929. And it was a second, far deadlier storm that finished the job on whatever confidence remained. In September of 1928, a hurricane drove the waters of Lake Okeechobee against the crude earthen dikes holding the lake in place. Picture that shoreline on the map, the thin brown line of levee separating farmland from open water, and then picture it simply failing. Floodwater poured across the surrounding communities with almost no warning, drowning entire towns of mostly migrant farm workers. Official counts at the time listed roughly 1,800 deaths, though historians who've since gone back through local records now believe the true toll was closer to 2,500 to 3,000 people, making it the deadliest natural disaster in Florida's history to this day. The aftermath revealed the era's brutal racial injustice as starkly as its death toll. White victims received identified burials, while nearly 700 black victims, disproportionately affected because they made up much of the region's agricultural workforce, were buried in a mass, unmarked grave in West Palm Beach that had no memorial at all until the year 2000. That disaster is what finally pulled the federal government directly into the picture. The Army Corps of Engineers took over large-scale water management across South Florida, building an enormous dike around Lake Okeechobee and cutting hundreds of additional miles of canals and levees into the map, explicitly designed to control flooding and open land for agriculture and urban growth. By 1927 alone, before the federal takeover had even fully begun, the state had already carved 440 miles of canals, 47 miles of levees, and 16 locks and dams through what used to be one continuous, slow-moving sheet of water. Trace the outline of modern Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach on a current map, and you're looking directly at the footprint of that engineering. But cutting the Everglades apart didn't just dry out excess water. It severed the natural flow that the entire ecosystem depended on to function, triggering decades of habitat collapse, salt water creeping into the aquifer that supplies drinking water to millions of South Florida residents, and the loss of more than half the Everglades' original footprint on the map. The lake at the center of that story is still being actively maintained today. Follow the shoreline of Lake Okeechobee on any current map, and you'll see 143 miles of earthen embankment ringing almost the entire lake, the modern successor to the crude dike that failed so catastrophically in 1928, named the Herbert Hoover Dike, after the president whose administration ordered it built in the storm's aftermath. That structure spent 18 years, from 2005 to 2023, undergoing a massive federal rehabilitation, crews building more than 56 miles of underground seepage barrier along the lake's southern edge, replacing dozens of aging water control structures and pouring roughly 90,000 cubic yards of concrete into a project that ultimately cost around $1.5 billion, finishing 3 years ahead of schedule. Trace that 143-mile ring on the map today, and you're looking at the only thing standing between the same lakeside towns drowned in 1928. Places like Belglade, Pahokee, and Moorhaven, and a repeat of the deadliest natural disaster in Florida's history. None of this drainage would have even been possible without one dangerous fact about the ground underneath the entire state, and it's worth pulling the camera down to ground level to actually see it. Almost the entire Florida peninsula sits on a foundation of soft, porous limestone, riddled with hidden caverns and voids carved out over millions of years by slightly acidic groundwater, the same kind of hidden geology responsible for disappearing rivers and sinkholes across much of the American South. Beneath that limestone runs the Floridan Aquifer, one of the most productive underground water systems on the planet, feeding more than 700 natural springs that punch up through the surface across the state, some large enough to form entire crystal-clear swimming holes, others little more than a bubbling patch in a forest floor. Florida is so saturated with this hidden cave network that it's widely nicknamed the sinkhole capital of the world. And unlike most karst landscapes, where sinkholes form gradually, Florida's have a track record of opening in minutes. In May of 1981, a sinkhole opened overnight in the middle of Winter Park, a suburb of Orlando, and grew within 2 days from a small crack in someone's backyard to nearly 350 feet wide and 100 feet deep, an area on the map large enough to swallow an entire city block. It ate part of a public pool, a repair shop full of Porsches, and an entire house, live on local television as stunned residents watched the ground itself disappear from the map in real time. The crater eventually settling into what's now a small lake still visible on any current map of the neighborhood. In 2013, a far more tragic sinkhole opened directly beneath a bedroom in Seffner, near Tampa, while a man named Jeffrey Bush slept inside. The floor gave way so suddenly his brother could only watch the bed drop straight down into the earth. Bush's body was never recovered. Florida is aware of this risk enough that the state legally requires home insurers to offer specific sinkhole coverage, a policy that exists in almost no other state, and claims tied to it now run into the hundreds of millions of dollars a year, because here, unlike almost anywhere else on the map, the ground your house sits on is never entirely guaranteed to stay put. By the late 20th century, the ecological damage from a century of drainage had become impossible to ignore. And the same federal government that spent decades tearing the Everglades apart turned around and began trying to redraw the map back towards something closer to its original shape. In 2000, Congress authorized the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, an effort designed to undo as much of the 20th century's drainage engineering as possible without abandoning the cities and farms already built on the reclaimed land. Originally projected at roughly $8 billion over 30 years, both numbers turned out to be dramatic underestimates. The most recent formal projections put the total cost above $23 billion, pushing toward $27 billion in current dollars, with a completion timeline stretching to roughly 50 years from authorization. It remains the largest ecosystem restoration project ever attempted anywhere on the planet. The restoration hasn't unfolded smoothly either, and much of the friction traces directly back to the same agricultural interests that benefited from the original drainage a century ago. Draw a box on the map immediately south of Lake Okeechobee, and you've outlined roughly 500,000 acres formerly known as the Everglades Agricultural Area, still in intensive sugarcane production today. And fertilizer runoff draining south out of that box is one of the primary pollutants restoration engineers are now trying to filter back out before the water can continue toward the park. A centerpiece of the modern plan, a massive reservoir designed to store and clean Lake Okeechobee water before releasing it south toward the Everglades on a more natural schedule, sits directly inside that same contested stretch of map and became the subject of a federal lawsuit in 2021 when major sugar corporations sued the Army Corps of Engineers over how much of that stored water they'd be entitled to draw for irrigation instead. Environmental groups countered that diverting the water would undercut the entire purpose of the reservoir. A federal judge sided with the Corps in 2023, though the sugar companies pursued an appeal. It's a fitting final line on the map. The same fight over who controls South Florida's water. Farmers wanting it for cultivation, engineers and conservationists wanting it restored to something closer to its natural flow, that's been playing out on this exact stretch of the peninsula since Napoleon Broward first promised to drain the swamp back in 1904, still isn't fully resolved more than a century later. Pull the camera all the way back out now until the whole state fills the frame again and look at everything sitting inside that outline. Start at the bottom of the frame. A piece of the Caribbean welded onto the bottom of Georgia by an accident of melting ice, its climate, wildlife, and coastline still behaving like a different country entirely. Alligators and crocodiles sharing water found nowhere else on the map, mangrove islands multiplying faster than anyone's ever managed to count them. Slide up to the panhandle, a border shaped not by any river or ridge, but by an argument over who controlled a port, sealed by an execution of foreign nationals that nearly triggered a war with two countries at once. Drop into the middle of the frame, into the flat green stretch where the river of grass used to flow uninterrupted. A war that, on the strictest reading of the historical record, arguably never technically ended. Fought by a nation that's since built a $12 billion business empire on the same land it refused to leave. And underneath all of it, the drained, dredged, re-engineered swamp itself, sold by the gallon to buyers who never saw it. Torn apart by 440 miles of canals, and now the site of the largest, most expensive attempt to undo a mistake in the history of American engineering, sitting on top of limestone so unstable, the ground itself can vanish out from under a house without warning. Florida is often treated, culturally, as the country's punchline, but trace the actual lines on its map. The border, the war, the drainage canals, the sinkholes opening without warning beneath the streets, and it might be the single best geographic argument that the United States, as a country, is far stranger, far more improvised, and far less finished than the neat borders on a map ever let on. Every other state you'll ever see traced on this channel has its own version of this same lesson hiding somewhere in its outline. Florida's is just unusually easy to see because so much of it is still, quite literally, being redrawn. If you want to see what other states have geographic and political oddities like this, hiding in plain sight on the map, let us know in the comments which state you want us to trace next, and subscribe so you don't miss it.